Welcome to Cantigny Park. Today we're going to be doing a little safety overview. We call it working safely from ground to crown. We're going to cover some major bullet points on how to work safely, starting from the shop and getting out on the job site. This isn't supposed to be a blueprint for how you do all tree work, just kind of some big reminders of stuff that we think are really important. My name is Beau Nagan. I'm the forestry manager here at Cantigny Park. I'm also the Illinois Arborist Association president-elect and Illinois tree climbing champion from last year. This is my associate, Chris Patnaude, aka Patty. He's been working in the industry for 3 years now for us. He does all of my brush dragging and climbing hawthorns. He's not a certified arborist yet, but he will be soon. He's a very good trainer though, and he'll be helping me out today. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about how to tie into the top of trees safely and some options and how to do that, okay? We got a small oak tree behind us here. We're going to take a look at this as if it were the top of a larger tree that we're looking to put a rope in, okay? So before we get started, I'd like to talk a little bit about how we set up the rope and how those forces are going to change depending on how we set up our climbing system. Here we have a rope already around a lower union. So as we have this set now, if I tie into this, I am single loading this union with my weight because my weight is directly being transferred from here to the branch with both sides of this rope sharing my weight. Now, me weighing about 200 pounds with gear, if I take this rope and I change it over to a basal anchor for single line style climbing or work positioning, and I clip this into my basal anchor. Now, in order for me to tie this off and to hold my weight, my 200 pounds here has to be supported by 200 pounds of force on this side, which transfers into adding 2 and 2 and making 400 pounds on my tie-in point. So I want you to keep that in mind, especially when we're looking at single rope climbing, because in the top of a tree, especially when you can't see the tie-in point as well as you might like, it could possibly be a hazard to tie into because of the forces that you put on that tree. So let's take a look at how we should tie in. The way this is set up right now is not a terribly safe way to tie in. It's on a horizontal branch, it's not around the main stem, and it's a bit of a horizontal branch. So for those of you that climb with natural crotch style climbing, which I wouldn't recommend because it damages the tree and it puts a lot of wear and tear on your rope, you have to keep in mind, as you move the rope, you can easily move it out of branch. So eventually you get to the point where as you work down the tree, to a different part of the canopy, you're so far out this branch now, the forces you're putting on this branch, which may be totally fine back here, become an extreme hazard out here where you can just snap off the limb with the forces that would be perfectly okay there. So let's talk about how to avoid that. For one, you want to always try, when possible, to tie in around the main upright stem. When choosing which union to pick, my advice to you with a higher canopy is always go one lower than you'd like. Because if you go to the highest one, it could be really difficult to determine if it's really safe or if it's weaker than something you'd actually like to tie into. So around the main stem, what that looks like this. So now we've tied in around the upright stem. We're putting the forces directly down the trunk of the tree. We're distributing them nicely, and it's really strong, okay? We can't slide out either way, and we're going to be staying that one point. So this is one reason why natural crotch climbing is not a great idea, because that's a lot of friction. It's not going to be fun to climb that way. So let's take a look at options for setup. One of my favorites is just a simple ring-to-ring style cambium saver. So here's one. I utilize this both for single line climbing and for double moving rope systems. So this is, you know, it's fully certified for a climbing tool. Make sure that everything you have is within the date that the manufacturer recommends, and it's already been inspected like we did earlier, okay? This can be installed from the ground, but for today's purposes, I'm just going to put it in myself. So install this around the same union, around the main stem, securely, single loading, and you go ahead. And the way this installs is one of these is slightly smaller than the other, which allows you to retrieve it from the ground. You're going to install through these small metal rings. They're both steel, so if they're pulled out of the tree, they shouldn't cause any damage. You should avoid that, but it shouldn't be a problem if you need to. Now when you tie in with our moving rope system, we now have reduced friction through these two rings. We have a good sturdy tie-in point. We're putting all the forces into the strongest part of the tree. So that's a good option. So for those of you that climb single line, what would that look like? How do we take that basal anchor forces and set up a similar system without eliminating our ability to single line? Well, with this tool right here, a real simple way that I like to use it, is I'll pull it all the way through, then I'll go ahead and I'll install an alpine butterfly knot in the rope on the back end of it, tie, dress, and set that neatly. Then I'll install a backup carabiner like this into that, and that allows me to pull this up into this friction saver and create a jam knot that won't pull through with the added security of that carabiner in there. So now I have the advantage of climbing on a single line static with my rope wrench without double loading that union. And the added bonus is that when I go to retrieve this, it's very smooth, there's no friction issues, and I'm not having any issues as far as rope on rope interaction or burning that rope, okay? So let's take a look at some other options of tying in as well. So this is with a ring-to-ring cambium saver, and like I said before, if I take my retrieval ball right here, I put it on the tail end of my rope, I can go ahead and retrieve this from the ground simply by pulling it out, and then it'll retrieve neatly like that to the ground. So what other options do we have? Well, if we're strictly single line climbing, another good option is go ahead and install a canopy anchor locked off at the top of the tree. So, let's see. I'm going to take this and install it into the same union. I'm going to go around the main stem as discussed before, and let's look at options for locking it off. So the simplest one would be just to tie an alpine butterfly like I did before for my jam knot. And then I'm going to go ahead and run it through and pull it to the top of the tree. When I do that, yet again, by doing that, I'm locking it off the top of the tree. I'm eliminating the double loading, and it's still retrievable when I'm done. So the issue with this system is that when I retrieve it, if I have redirected this and I pull it down, I'm getting really bad rope-on-rope interaction, which could possibly burn this rope and damage it to the point where I can't use it. Okay, let's look at another option on how we can tie in statically and not compound our forces with a basal tie, but still climb single line, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take my line and install it around the main stem like I did before. And unlike last time where I had that added friction that I didn't want running on my rope for retrieval, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add a piece of hardware into the system to mitigate the friction that would be on this rope during retrieval. For that, I'm just going to use a medium-sized rigging ring. You can use the brand that you like. This is an All Gear. There's numerous other companies that make them. You just make your alpine butterfly, you install it into the rim of the medium-sized rigging ring. Go ahead and tie, dress, and set that and tighten it up. has a tendency to orient really nicely vertically for installing. Then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take the working end of my rope and I'm going to run it through the ring and girth it off at the top of the tree. So the reason I like this is it's simple. It eliminates that double loading factor, and it adds protection to my rope for when I do retrieve with maybe that one redirect, and then it mitigates that and runs smoothly through that piece of hardware, eliminating the rope-on-rope interaction that could damage your rope and possibly cause failure. So as we go through all these things, I'd like to remind you that your ground crew needs to 100% understand all your setups and how they work in case of an emergency situation where you have to be rescued. Because if they don't understand your setup, there's a high chance that you could be injured due to their unfamiliarity with it and possibly causing you fall out of the tree by handling the situation wrong. Let's talk a little bit about installing a basal anchored rope through multiple unions. So this has some benefits and it has some drawbacks. The number one benefit is when you install the rope through multiple unions through the tree, you're going to disperse the force that you're putting on all those unions, which means potentially you could get higher up in the tree using slightly smaller unions to share that force. So what's negative about that? Well, in order to do that, the rope has to travel through a larger portion of the tree. So depending on your scope of work that you're doing in the tree, it could be in your way more. It could be in the way of more cuts. It could be in the way of your climbing plan throughout the tree, even in certain ways, depending on how you have to travel through the tree. So just keep that in mind when you're using multiple unions to not get in your own way with the install if you're going to do it that way. Okay, so let's take a look at its setup. I'm going to tie this to the base of the tree, and we'll take a look at some of the things we want to consider when we're looking at any basal anchor, let alone this. So the way I like to tie a basal anchor with just rope is to tie a variation of a cow hitch essentially. But with a cow hitch where I'd normally come through here for rigging, I'm going to go ahead and come through with just one leg of the rope and then come back and tie stationary bowline on there with a backup. So since this is for life support, I'm going to put a Yosemite finish on there. And then the reason I tie it this specific way is that I can move it both ways and it'll load bidirectionally and it'll lock off really firmly on the base of that tree and it won't move no matter how I load that from aloft. Okay, so I have that tied off nice and firm. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the same ring that I used before to install my canopy anchor girthed off at the top of the tree to put an extra safety feature in here. I'm going to put an alpine butterfly in here pretty high up, high as the shortest guy on my crew that's on the ground can reach. And I'm going to install this in here nice and neat. And what this is, that's an added rescue feature so that if somebody has the potential to be able to lower me from the ground when injured, they can install a rope in here and use a mechanical advantage system to tighten this up, untie that system and safely lower me. That's a whole different level of training and something that you need to work out with your crews. And that's very different training that we're talking about. This is bare bones, but if you add this in, this would give anybody an advantage of taking this system down, whether it's you or fire rescue crews. So just keep that in mind, because tying a knot in a rope that's already loaded is going to be pretty impossible. Okay? So let's take a look at the setup too. Some of the things that we have to consider when we look at this is the fact that when you're working aloft and cutting branches, they can fall. So if you're tied into this, or they're going to fall, and when they hit, they can hit your rope. So when you're using a basal anchor, one of my worries always is that when the branch hits, and this has actually happened to me before and it's large enough, and if it hits this rope, it pulls you up. So whenever you're making cuts in the tree and you're tied in this way, you want to make sure that that branch is not going to hit your basal anchor. Another thing you have to consider is your ground personnel. You want to make sure that they aren't using chainsaws or other cutting tools close to this. So if that branch lands up against the tree, you sure don't want to see your guys running a chainsaw within a couple of inches of your lifeline that's attached at the base of the tree. This all comes in your work plan and discussing with your crews the do's and don'ts and them understanding the system that you have set up. So how do we mitigate the branches hitting it? Well, one thing that we can do is when we set this up, we can set it up in a way, let me loosen this up a little bit, where instead of it having it just space between the trunk and, and where we're tied in, we go ahead and we twist the system around as much as we can so that it's wrapped up against the tree in a way where it stays nice and close to the trunk all the way around, and there's very little gaps of air in between the trunk and the rope that causes potential for where a branch could fall and hit that rope. Okay? So, yet again, when we look up, I just want to point out the fact that we're through multiple unions in the top of this fake canopy, but the one branch that I'm through is significantly too small to actually have a rope through. I just have that in for demonstration purposes. Whenever we're climbing into anything, remember our rule of thumb for tie-ins is 4 inches, but that's very species dependent, and it's very dependent on the condition of the tree. So if you have an oak tree, 4 inches is great. If you have a cottonwood, you might want to bump it up to 6. So know your species of your tree, understand how they're going to react different based on how they grow and how you're loading them with your climbing systems. Okay, so now we're going to start taking a look at a secondary assessment of the tree before we climb it and actually begin our work. So we're going to do that by doing HOPE. HOPE stands for hazards, obstacles, plan, and equipment. Okay, so to begin HOPE, hazards. Okay, so we did a big job briefing where we walked around, but now we're going to fine-tune it with this specific tree on the job that we're going to work before we climb it. Okay, so the way I normally do it is I start with an outer canopy to inner canopy inspection. Outer canopy means walking around the whole tree on the outer drip edge of the tree, looking for major hazards like hanging branches, loose hardware, and utility lines that could possibly hurt me before I enter. Why would a utility line hurt me? Maybe in a storm damage scenario where there's already damage and you don't know a house drop's been ripped off or something like that. Okay, so I'm going to walk around the exterior of the tree. Once I've assessed that it's safe enough to enter the interior of the tree, then I'm going to do a secondary walk around the tree where I'm going to get closer and I'm going to look at the trunk, okay? I'm going to look for vertical and horizontal cracks. I'm going to look for included bark on branch attachments. I'm going to look down at the root flare and make sure there's a good wide root flare that says to me that it's got a good stable root system. I'm going to look for heaving in the soil if there's an uprooting problem. I'm going to look for mushrooms in case there's possibly decay fungi in the root system, or butt rot where it might show that there's some serious decay in this tree and I might consider not climbing it. So one really simple tool and cheap tool I like to keep on the truck is a mallet. You want a soft mallet because I'm going to use this to strike the tree. So most of our tree failures happen fairly low to the ground. So like, breast height, DBH height. So we're looking at 4 feet, 6 feet. So I'm going to take my mallet and I'm going to walk over to the tree and I'm going to go ahead and use that to strike the tree and listen. Okay, so as I hit the tree, it's nice and firm. I'm not hearing any deep drum noises. There's no hollows in this tree. I'd walk all the way around this tree normally and strike it. I've already done it. But I'm also going to do some of the leads. Like maybe I want to tie into this. If you hear that, there's a bit of hollow there. There's an old wound here that healed, and there's probably some decay, and there's a bit of a cavity in here. So part of my work plan for this tree a little bit later down HOPE is going to be to avoid putting too much stress on this limb if I want to keep it, or possibly reducing that limb. Okay? So, I've done my walk around. I've assessed this tree is safe to climb. One of the other important things is to make sure you keep good communication with your ground crew and make them known what you discovered in this tree, so they know the hazards you're trying to avoid, and then they also can avoid the same hazards, okay? Whether that's maybe there's a big enough tree that there's a bald-faced hornet's nest in one side, and I'm just going to avoid that side of the tree because I don't actually need to do any work over there, but I'm still going to climb a tree with some, with some hornets in it. But they don't want to drag the rigging rope across that nest if you're doing some rigging in the tree, okay? So, we've taken a look at the tree, we've determined it's safe, we've identified where our utilities were with our walk around, because again, utilities are one of the #1 things that are going to really kill you in a hurry if you come in contact with them. So know where they are, okay? And if that's a removal, that means know where they are underground if you're grinding stumps. So that means contacting Julie or Dig or whoever the utility provider is in your area, okay? So, that's our hazards, okay? Next is obstacles, okay? So what are obstacles? Obstacles are anything that we can break, we don't want to damage, or things that are in our way. Fences, buildings, cars, things like that. Things that nobody's actually going to get hurt, but we want to avoid. That could mean holes in the ground we're walking through, uneven terrain that could cause injuries, but not necessarily an immediate threat to our lives. So we identify those areas, and our work plan is going to be around that. We're going to set our equipment up in a way where we're going to avoid having to drag brush through certain areas and damage possibly flower beds. We're going to avoid dropping branches on fences or buildings, and we're going to utilize rigging equipment where we need to, okay? So those are our obstacles. We're in the middle of a field. We have 0 obstacles, unless we want to consider the turf an obstacle, and depending on the level of the care of the turf, that may be an obstacle. It might be a 0 impact situation where you have to rig every tiny branch down. Hopefully not. So we've covered obstacles, hazards, obstacles. Next is our plan, okay? So let's step over here to our equipment, all right? So I've used my mallet, I'm done with that. So number 1, in every single situation where we're climbing a tree, this equipment is a necessity. This is our rescue kit and our first aid kit, okay? It includes my other climber's climbing kit, which is fully inspected, clean, rope that's in good shape or relatively clean, but more importantly well inspected, that he's familiar with and comfortable climbing with. Since a lot of times I know companies like to have a specific designated rescue kit, and that's fine, but in our smaller intimate group where we're very familiar with our equipment and we like what we like and we're comfortable with what we're comfortable with, we use our primary climbing kit because we take good care of it. We have a throw line, we have a climbing kit, we have a first aid kit that's very specific for our type of work, which is forestry. So it's going to be heavy duty, it's going to have bigger stuff for bigger trauma. I have specific things in there that I already went over with you that I like to have in my first aid kit. And I have water. Water's a big deal, especially in the summertime, okay? Heat exhaustion up to heat stroke is a big problem. We recently had one of our ground staff have heat exhaustion and have to go to the clinic. So it's something that you have to stay on top of, whether that means not just hydrating, but also making sure you have good, healthy food in your system, keeping you going, and possibly maybe extra electrolytes. We have electrolyte pills that we like to take just to keep us going because we don't like to drink a lot of Gatorade. Now we're going to move on to what I need to do this tree. I got some deadwood I want to clear out of this tree. I don't have any real rigging. I'm not too concerned about the ground, so I have a pretty minimal kit here. I have my throw line right here to get my rope installed into the top of the canopy. I have my tree motion harness here that I'm going to use to climb, that we already inspected earlier, that's ready to go. I've got my climbing line that's been inspected. I've got my friction saver I'm going to use, and then I have my chainsaw that all safety features are functioning on and are ready to go, okay? So now I've got my plan pretty set, I got my equipment set. Let's backpedal a little bit to the plan, because one of the other really important things with the plan is efficiency in work, okay? So when you make your plan for your work, it's not just about what you're going to do with the tree, but it's about how you're going to do it in the tree. And what that means is when I ascend in, I'm always using energy. I want to minimize the energy I expend by avoiding going up and down as much as possible. So when I plan a tree prune, I try and do it in a bell curve. I'm going to work as much as I can on the way up, and I'm going to work as much as I can on the way down. That way, as I go uphill, and I have to go uphill, I'm doing as much as I can, and then hopefully the rest of the day is going to be all downhill. That way I'm minimizing the amount of energy I use going up and down. It's never possible to do it exactly like that, but it's a plan that I want you to keep in your head when you're working so you can be as efficient as possible, okay? And then when working in a tree, especially a large canopy tree like the one behind me, you got to keep in mind that when you're changing tie-in points, try to take your primary system out as little as possible. We always have to be tied in once, either with our lanyard or a primary climbing system, but the most danger comes when we're changing primary climbing systems and we disconnect from that primary climbing system, because sometimes we forget to clip it back on, and then you take your lanyard off and all of a sudden you're off the ground and you're not tied in. So that's pretty much covers hope, and we should be ready to get up in the tree now and take a look at ascent and some other safety considerations in the top of the tree. Okay, so we've assessed the tree. We've decided that it's safe. we're ready to ascend into the tree. So now we got to talk about what that looks like, okay? So we've installed our canopy anchor into the top of the tree, and as we discussed before, what that does for us is it decreases the load on the tree. Since we're single lining, we're not doing a basal tie, so this is going to be a little bit safer to climb on because we're putting less force on that tie-in point, okay? So however you want to ascend the tree, the important thing is that it's efficient for you. So whatever conserves the most energy for you to get from the bottom to the top is how you should climb the tree. For me, that's a single line system, okay? So my favorite system is the rope wrench system. So let's talk about this. This is going to be what you do with your system regardless of what it is, but we're going to discuss how to install this safely and how to begin our ascent and make sure that we have everything squared away before we leave the ground. The first thing that we want to do with this particular tool is we want to make sure that the hitch that we've tied will hold us without the rope wrench engaged, okay? So that's going to be figuring out what hitch cord and hitch that you tie is going to work best with the rope that you choose to climb on. So before I leave the ground, I'm going to go ahead. I've tied a VT here on my Teufelberger 10 millimeter epi cord, which is my personal favorite. I'm going to clip into this. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to tighten it up and I'm going to sit in it and just make sure it holds. And it holds well. So the next thing we have to do to ascend safely with this particular system is we have to engage the rope wrench. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to put that on our rope. Once we get it on the rope, we're going to make sure that when we push this pin in, that the small spring-loaded retention tooth captures that rope wrench fully and engages. If you don't do that, when you descend on this particular system, you can damage your rope when this small tooth starts rolling across the fibers when it's under tension, and it can shred the rope. So that's really important, okay? So another thing that personally helps me conserve energy is not having to make sure that my right foot ascender captures the rope as I climb. So a little weight at the base of the rope, if I don't have someone to hold that for me on the ground, always helps. So anytime I'm going to use a chainsaw when aloft, what I do is I go ahead and I tie the chainsaw on the tail of my rope to give me a little weight on the base so that as I ascend, it's a lot easier and more efficient and I don't waste any energy trying to start going up that rope. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take my saw, and I usually will leave my scabbard on the saw to ensure that it doesn't damage my rope as I ascend. So I'm going to go ahead and tie it on the handle of the saw. So even though I have that scabbard on, I'm going to have the cutting portion of the saw pointing downward away from me. So if the scabbard were to fall off right away, I wouldn't have any chance of coming in contact with that chain. Even though it's not moving, as we know, they're very sharp and we can still get cut. So then at this point, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to attach my Ascent system. Do a little online test, even with the system, get my two ascenders on, and I'm ready to go up. Okay, so we're all ready to ascend now. I'm going to head up the tree, and this is when we start with our second hazard assessment of the tree. So now we're going to look at the tree as we ascend to make sure there's nothing we missed from the ground that might tell us, hey, we can't climb this tree, we got to come to the ground and find another plan, which may be an aerial lift or tying into a different lead of the tree. So I'm going to start my ascent now. Sometimes it's going to be a little challenging to see where you're going. Up in the tree, let me give myself a little spin, and up we go. So this is a pretty hefty bur oak, and as you can see as I ascend and inspect the tree, I'm not really out of breath because I'm going nice and smooth. I'm taking the time to make a plan as I go up. If I wanted to stop and work here, I might stop and move over now, as opposed to going all the way to the top. But my plan is to go to the top. So as I go up, I'm looking for cavities in the tree I didn't see. I'm looking for splits. I'm looking for anything that I might not have noticed, like hanging branches, old hardware, anything that might be an issue. But everything looks real solid. So, once I get to the top here, I'm going to go ahead and take a moment and stop, really engage my climbing system to make sure it holds. As you ascend, a lot of times, it can become really loose and then possibly not grab properly. So make sure your hitch is catching. Okay, now we're up at the top of the canopy, and I want to talk a little bit about how to most efficiently and safely use our harness and our lanyard together, okay? So number one, when we're up a tree working aloft, the best way to use our harness and feel comfortable and safe is to make sure as much as possible we're leaning into it, okay? Anytime we have a lot of slack in our harness, that's when we feel uncomfortable and like we're on a balance beam in the top of the tree. That's not a comfortable place to be. It's not a safe place to be. So as much as we can keep tension in that system as possible, remember, we're working on a static system, so no slack, as little slack as possible at all times, okay? And remember the rule, slack below our knees is too much, because that creates quite the fall. So, moving on, when we look at the system, I want to talk a little bit about how this works with this particular harness. This tree motion harness has a double rope bridge, okay? So it's a little added safety if you accidentally cut one. But this is the only thing currently holding me from falling to the ground, right? It's this ring attached to this rope. So if this rope gets severed, I lose my ability to stay in this tree. So why is that important? Because whenever we make cuts with chainsaws, and hopefully with hand saws as much as possible, we use our secondary life support lanyard. Now, a lot of times for work positioning, I like to use this harness in a lot of different ways. So maybe I want to go ahead and take this lanyard, and for work positioning purposes, I'm going to clip it on the becket and create a small climbing system with this lanyard. And maybe it's really comfortable for me to move it over and put it on my life support, my main life support ring. So I'm in a really stable position. Maybe I want to work over here and cut. But the problem with this particular setup is I still only have one real life support connection, because if I sever these ropes holding my bridge, I still fall out of the tree, okay? So how can we do this safely? Well, the best way to do it and most ergonomic way to do it is by utilizing our lower Ds, okay? So if I take the same setup, but I go ahead and I loosen this lanyard up, and I clip it on my side D, lower D, I'm sorry, my lower D, and then I go ahead and clip it on the other side. Now what I've done is I've created both a good stable work positioning like I did before, a little difference but still very similar, but now I've taken the rope bridge out of the equation. So now if I cut this rope bridge, I'm still suspended by the majority of my harness and my lower Ds. If I cut the lanyard, I'm still supported by my rope bridge and my main primary climbing system. So as you can see, it's a simple step you can take to make sure, just by being conscious of where you clip in, that you're really truly tied in twice to the tree when you're using a chainsaw. So let's talk a little bit about our upper Ds to lower Ds, okay? So let me reset my lanyard quickly, and we'll take a quick look at being tied in to a stem and what would happen if, per se, we were mainly in our lanyard as opposed to our rope, into our primary climbing system. So if I take my lanyard on my upper Ds and I were to tie into this lead here, and something were to happen for some reason, I had too much slack in the system, or maybe I cut this rope and I'm stuck in just this lanyard on these upper Ds, what would it look like if I fell into it? And what would it be like to rescue me? Because whenever we're making a good climbing plan, the important thing is to consider what it's going to be like for someone if they have to come up and rescue if something happens to you. So let's look at what it looks like if I am solely in this lanyard. I have my secondary attachment on first. Remember, we never want to untie from our primary suspension point and climbing system if possible, okay? Sometimes we have to recrotch and that's necessary, but the more time you spend on this, the safer. One of the most dangerous things we can do is disconnect from our primary climbing system. So let's take a quick look at what it looks like if I have to hang in just these upper Ds. I'm gonna go ahead and put my weight in it. Oh. So now this is a really non-ergonomical, very uncomfortable position to be in, okay? If somebody had to come rescue me, it would be really challenging. It would be hard for them to get access to these points. And to be honest with you, I'm already tired of being in this position for a couple of seconds. So what can we do to fix that when we use our lanyard? We're gonna go ahead, and even if we just change it over, let's say we go crosswise and we do one lower D and one upper, what does that look like? Well, right there, that alone makes me more comfortable, because I like to utilize all of my attachment points on my harness for different work positioning depending on the situation, since no situation's the same. And then let's take a look at clipping onto both of my lower Ds. Now I'm suspended just like my harness and my climbing system. My legs are supported, my back is supported. I'm in a comfortable position. I wouldn't want to, but I could probably sit right here for a couple of hours if I had to, okay? So keep those in mind. And then another thing that we have to keep in mind when we talk about our lanyarding in is if we're making a cut, and the only option is to lanyard into the exact same branch that we're cutting, what could happen? Well, let's take a look at this branch right here. I'm going to lanyard in here with my upper D's, okay, my less comfortable D's, and we'll go ahead and I'll clip in our lanyard. The way this is set up, if this were to break out and drag me in and split, if I cut it poorly, it could actually crush me up against the stem. Not quite as bad on a smaller one like this, but if I'm taking a spar out, I'm taking the whole trunk out, and I'm lanyarded around that, it can pull you in because of the way it loads and drag you all the way in, and then keep spreading out and crushing your back up against that cut you're making because of the way you're attached and how it would put pressure on your harness and force you into that branch you're cutting. Now, as discussed before, if I go ahead and switch to my lower D's, now if that branch loads, it's just going to pull between the rope harness and the lanyard, and I'm not going to be affected at all. And hopefully all of my life support is strong enough to support that branch long enough for it to fall off and me to stay safe. So that's just something you want to keep in mind. Okay, so we've moved throughout the canopy a little bit. We've gotten away from our main tie-in point. And I would like to point out, since I'm getting further out the tips, if you look back to our main tie-in point, you can see that I traversed over the top of this lateral limb to ensure that I didn't make a really poor rope angle, because if I had gone underneath, I'd have quite the drastic swing back towards the trunk, really putting myself at risk if I were to slip off and lose my footing. So always keep that in mind when you're traversing through the tree. Make a good work plan from the top of the tree and look at your best angles and the best way to protect yourself from a real bad pendulum swing back into the trunk, because it's a real easy way to get hurt, and especially later in the day when you're getting fatigued, it can seem like a good idea to go under instead of over because it's a little bit more ascent. So keep that in mind. So now that we're up here, I'd like to talk a little bit about using cutting tools in the tree, and specifically chainsaws. Okay, so number one, whenever we're making a cut in the tree, keep in mind this is, an 11.1 millimeter dragonfly line. It's not terribly thick. It doesn't take a whole lot to cut this. So when you think about the fact that you're 50 feet off the ground on an 11 millimeter rope, wielding a chainsaw, it makes a little bit of sense to stay tied in twice, right? In fact, if you were to tell most people that, they'd probably tell you how incredibly smart you weren't, right? So let's go that extra step. Let's lanyard in every time. And let's even lanyard in whenever we even are using a handsaw as much as possible, because, if you hang from a rope under tension, it's very easy to sever a rope with handsaw as much as it is with a chainsaw. And I've put some pretty big hacks through the years in some ropes inadvertently, because accidents do happen. Luckily nothing's happened, but keep that in mind. A sharp handsaw, as we all know, from getting cuts on our arms, which is also an issue. So let's take a look to my right here a little bit. I'm going to move out this limb a little bit and get into position to make a chainsaw cut, okay? So first thing I want to look for is small stubs and whatnot to get stable footing. I'm about as far out this branch as I can, and my plan is just to cut that side of that branch off with my chainsaw, okay? So I want to take a look at where I want to put my lanyard. So for me, I never want to put my lanyard in the union that I want to cut, personally. If at all possible, if there were a union above to lanyard into and give me good opposition, a comfortable work position, I'd choose that. But since there isn't, I'm going to go ahead and utilize this little upright growth here. I'm going to take my lanyard around that, and I'm going to go ahead, and yet again, I really like my lower D's. So I'm going to go ahead and move my lanyard there, clip there, and I'm going to clip on this D here. And it's going to give me a good stable position. I'm going to snug that up, make sure it's firm. And as you can see, I'm going to get into a position where I have as little movement. Move my foot again. Use my knee. As little movement as possible. I'm going to get in as stable as a position as possible, okay? So I have 1, 2, 3 points of contact with my left foot. My knee marginally counts, but we always have to maintain 3 points of contact, when we're making a cut, to ensure that we stay stable, okay? I'm happy with the opposition between these two, though. I'm not moving a lot. Next, we're going to make a chainsaw cut. We're starting in the tree. So let's talk about starting the chainsaw in the tree. Number one, hearing protection, always important when using loud tools, chainsaws, chippers, the like. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure I got both of my muffs on, and I'm protecting my ears. Next, When we were on the ground, we talked about there's only two real safe ways to start a chainsaw. There's the leg lock, and then there's the putting it on the ground, putting a foot on it, and pulling from the ground from one knee. So I don't really have those options here, so let's talk about some options. Take my chainsaw, and if you notice, I got my handsaw and my chainsaw on the same side. All my cutting tools are here. My life support's here. This is the side I keep my life support lanyard on. So that keeps them separated to reduce the amount of chances I have to sever those rope tools when I'm using my cutting tools. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at options for starting this saw. If possible in the tree, if I'm in a comfortable union and I can do a leg lock, I'll go ahead and I'll get firm in there and I'll do a pull like that. And I go ahead, I did a fairly safe leg lock there, okay? Also, you know, obviously my bar's locked. I don't have a chance of cutting anything. But the downside of that, I'm pretty close to that. We want to avoid drop starting, but keeping a good stiff arm locked and pulling the chainsaw keeps it away from our cutting tools, and it gives us a comfortable start and avoid flipping the saw up towards our head or doing anything foolish with it, okay? Yet again, before we leave the ground, we make sure all our safety features are functioning. We make sure that bar lock is engaged, okay? So let's take a look at this cut. I'm comfortable. I can put two hands on this chainsaw. Top-handled saw does not mean one-handled saw, okay? I'm going to get in a position where I can make a cut with two hands comfortably. If you can't get out with your chainsaw and make a two-handed cut in the tree, you're not a good enough climber to use a chainsaw in a tree, okay? There's no excuses for unsafe acts. Most times I see people using one hand with a chainsaw as laziness. If you're worried about holding that limb, put a rope on it, okay? Don't say I need to hold the branch and cut your left arm. I've met too many tree workers that have chainsaw taps all the way up their left arms, okay? So there's no excuse for it. I'm pretty much so at the tip of this branch. I can go ahead and make a cut comfortably with two hands with good work positioning, okay? So let's go ahead and make that cut, okay? I'm gonna put my arm straight out. I'm gonna start it. I'm going to go ahead and take my bar lock off, and now I'm going to make the cut. I'm not going to make the cut. It's an oak tree. You guys can't prune oak trees in the summertime. You guys know better than that. Come on. But as you can see, I got all the way to the point where I could make all those cuts. I'm safe. I'm stable. I'm avoiding hurting myself, and I'm following all the same standards I would on the ground when operating a chainsaw. Before we get up and get to work in the tree, why don't we talk a little bit about rigging etiquette and some things we can do to stay safe on the ground. We're not going to get too deep into rigging, but I want to talk a little bit about it so we have some good bullet point safety before we get going. Number one, when we're talking about using friction devices in rigging, a couple of things are really important. First off, he's wearing, Patty behind me here is wearing good rigging gloves made of leather. I climb in rubberized gloves that are fabric. They're really poor for rigging, and you have a tendency to ruin them immediately when you run a rope with them. So it's good to have dedicated rigging gloves that are made for leather, and you can always use them double for maintaining chainsaws as well, which, as we know, we need to wear gloves when we're sharpening chainsaws. So always have only one person running the porter wrap. When we're trying to limit the forces we put on rigging points, we're always running the rope, which means when we cut the branch and it drops out of the tree, as it falls, we let it run through the friction device and slowly decelerate the load before we actually let it get to the ground. If we have two people running this rope at the same time, it's pretty impossible to perfectly coordinate that slow descent and then stopping the load before it damages anything with two sets of hands on there. The whole purpose of that device is so that one person can rig down a really significant load. So what else is important? If you look at Patty, we have the large rigging bag right here in front of him in his line of sight. That means when the rope starts running, there's no chance of it being behind him, getting caught in his feet and causing a hazard for him while he's rigging. And every time that Patty's done rigging, he takes the time to put the rope back into the bag so it's stowed out of the way and it's not going to get entangled in anything. So let's take a look at how Patty's set up. So we're using the porter wrap right now as friction, and what that allows us to do is see how far away he actually is from the tree. He can actually walk in multiple different directions and as far back as he needs to stay out of the traveling path of that load that we're rigging down. So don't get in the mindset that you have to be right next to that porta wrap when you're rigging, because you can move in multiple different directions and take as much rope as that you have available far away to rig that down. Keep in mind when you're rigging though, the length of your rope is going to have to be double the height of your rigging point, so make sure you have enough rope. Most of the time I like to have 200 foot of rope, but that's a personal preference. You might not need that. So let's take a look at what that looks like when we're rigging down the branch, okay? Patty, why don't you come on in here? This is a pretty light branch. We just have this for demonstration purposes. In fact, it's light enough that we can't run it through the porta wrap to run it. But let's go ahead and show what it looks like for a load to swing, a rigger to stay out of the way, and for him to slowly lower it to the ground. So we're going to put a little swing on this as if we rigged it from the canopy. We're going to take a look at what that looks like. Give me a little slack. All right, ready? So when it swings, he's going to lower it to the ground slowly or letting it run. So stand clear. Clear. Cutting. Send it. That was super exciting. So as you can see, he's out of the way. The branch was able to run. One set of hands on there. Good leather gloves, keeping it out of the keeping clear of the rigging with the bag in front of us. There's a lot more that goes into rigging, but that's just some basics as far as a little housekeeping. Speaking of which, it's also very important once you start cutting material and putting it on the ground to keep the work area as clear as possible. You don't want sticks and branches to get caught in your rigging line when it's trying to run up and entangle in your porta wrap. Another thing that's really important is when you drag those branches to the chipper, you really got to make sure that your rigging line and your climbing line is not entangled in that brush, because if you pull that into the chipper, somebody could get hurt or killed if it's a climber if it's dragged into that chipper.